So, good morning. Thank you, Mr. Chairman, my fellow debater, ladies and gentlemen. So, first of all, I'm going to declare my hand, and I got delivered a Charles Darwin hat. So I'm going to wear that. I'm very much a neo-Darwinist at heart, so I declare my evolutionary stance in these proceedings. So, we have before us this question of the adequacy of the impact assessment for the protection of biodiversity. And we hear it's on decline globally, and it does tend to get a bad rap. IA gets a bit of a bad rap, and is often accused as being responsible for the decline in our biodiversity, our insects, our birds, our iconic and even our less iconic mammals. And actually a report in recently in New Zealand, the latest SOE report, State of the Environment report, suggests the same trend there. But can we simply point to this one process and call it the blunt tool that's resulting in this biodiversity decline? And after so many years, 50 years we've heard, and decades of practice and development of this tool for achieving that aim, can we call it inadequate and really a blunt tool? And I will argue no, that it is not. And in fact, in this room, we've probably got many decades, perhaps even centuries collectively of expertise in IA who've been working at this, and I'll be going to dismiss it as a failure for the prevention of biodiversity loss. So, Mr. Chairman, ladies and gentlemen, I suggest not. So let me put to you that IA is not a blunt tool for protecting biodiversity, and I think that it is a powerful tool, and persuade you that the no vote is the only logical, coming back to that term, and persuasive response to the question. Now, I do note that I'm standing in front of those favouring the no right now. One had the big advantage of standing in front and talking directly to you, so I'm going to focus my approach on the other side of the room. And I had intended to walk around, but it's probably easier to stand here and do that. But let's just go through some things. First of all, the IA process is the foundation of our biodiversity assessment. The question of what biodiversity is present, what is important, what needs protection, what management, all comes from the IA process. And these are fundamental questions. And we recognise we cannot measure and look at all things, but we can measure the important things, and we can give some thought to the potential for ecosystems to improve. And that potential question actually is, in New Zealand, is becoming more and more prevalent in our thinking and management of our biodiversity. And not only that, we look for more at the functionality of our systems, our flow paths, the water flow paths, the pollution pathways, migration pathways, the feeding habits of some of our better known organisms, and the functionality. And as Mr. Chairman, our chairman pointed out, I come from a background of freshwater ecology, mainly on invertebrates. So I'm something of an entomologist, so I do favour some of the far side illustrations. So it founds a foundation for it all. It's also developing, and we heard from my colleague, my erstwhile colleague here, that it's developing over time. And it has to develop as societal values move forward. Unlike Mr. Darwin, who challenged the prevailing views at the time, the IA is actually developing over time in its step-by-step process, as indeed the evolutionary pathway is. So we move to things like we map we do mapping of our biodiversity systems. This is one example from New Zealand, where the darker shadings are a whole area of very high integrity ecosystem, and we move to avoid all of that. It's actually an area of iconic kauri tree. So we put all those right up front in the IA process. We are now involved in a lot of species translocations, landscape assessments of function, all of this moving into a far more accurate and balanced tool for assessing biodiversity. And more recently, even migrations and feeding habits of some of our lesser known and highly threatened species. So all that is happening as well around the world in our biodiversity assessments. The whole of this, to me, is also getting mainstream into this mitigation hierarchy. And we've heard quite a lot already about that at our conference this week. Even this morning I was at a session, and there's more to come. And how well and how successful is this? My own experience of this and acting as a decision maker and a commissioner is it's well substantiated in the mainstream now of decision making. And particularly the question of avoidance. Tremendous emphasis going on to rethinking and reshaping developments to avoid areas of high importance, biodiversity importance, or areas of high functionality. And we work closely with engineers in doing that. And then at the other end of the scale is the whole offset question and compensation. My erstwhile friend here did point out the complexities of the language, and I agree. We have yet to land that language comfortably for the layperson, for the for other disciplines like engineers, and even for some of the decision makers. But decisions are coming out of, at least in New Zealand, out of our High Court on some of these matters. And we have learned from that avoid means avoid. And in all our plans where we've got avoid written down, it means avoid. Now, all the regulators are scrabbling to sort of say, well, actually, we didn't really mean avoid, literally. But that will play itself in the next round of plans. And we're also doing a lot more management of our functionalities. So IA, as Mr. Chairman pointed out, was a revolutionary concept when it first came on the scene. But it is not and cannot be a static tool or process. It has to continually improve and adapt to changing societal values and new knowledge in our learnings. And we've got increasing issues in front of us, which we struggle with. Climate change, cumulative effects, ecosystem services, and other challenging in practice. And the whole question of the use of strategic environmental assessments early in developments or early in the planning process has yet to come to its full fruition. My erstwhile friend did mention competency, expertise. So let's just talk about that for a moment. We all recognise that there is a continuum, of course, in competency, in impact assessment and biodiversity assessment, as there is in all skills, from the highly competent and experienced to those less so. And we even have some rogue elements in places. And that does not help AA be the sharp tool in many cases. What we do know, though, that there's an increasingly number of courses, there's an increasing number of accreditations, there's an increasing number of peer institutes that are acknowledging their peers as being competent and experienced in that. And they can do postgraduate studies now in biodiversity impact assessment. And also, we have the question of uptake. The whole uptake of biodiversity impact assessment is strong and well developed amongst corporates. Some recent research in New Zealand was very illuminating to show how often the biodiversity question is the first cab off the rank in any constraints analysis. And certainly amongst the larger corporates, but the small under-resourced developers are those that require assistance and are struggling, and often are the ones that are ignoring this. But nevertheless, the uptake is strong and in the decision-making process. Finally, I just want to come to the question of fit for purpose. The impact assessment for biodiversity, is it or is it not fit for purpose? And I argue that yes, it is. The purposeful delivery of results for biodiversity protection from developments on land or at sea. So let us remember, and I think sometimes we forget this, that the biodiversity impact assessment informs a decision. It is not in itself the decision. And obviously any panel or receiving body has to make that assessment and balance that against all the other assessments that are going on. And I also remind myself and ourselves that in our commissioner work in New Zealand, we talk about three main elements in a decision. The facts or the evidence before us, the assumptions that we're making in our thinking, and our own expert opinions. And I contend that a biodiversity impact assessment process can deliver on all three of those to inform a decision. So what is next? No, we're not. So those are the main points. So what's next? Well, yes, I contend that the biodiversity impact assessment process is sufficient for the protection of biodiversity, but it needs to continually evolve. Hence, my Charlie Darwin hat. or perhaps it needs to re-evolve. The legislation and policy does need to be stronger, more specific and clearer in most jurisdictions, and can deliver the outcomes. There needs to be more certainty around the language and meanings that need improving, and a translation into a layman's terms. And we need to return to a very clear outcome focus for biodiversity impacts. So, in conclusion, impact is the foundation and has all the attributes for the protection of biodiversity, and it's not a blunt tool for biodiversity protection. Thank you, Mr. Chair.